As Stuart said, I'm Carla Gangler-Nowak, and I'm a Grants and Contracts Administrator. I've done this since 2002, all at Ohio State University, so I have seen just about every permutation of a health sciences grant that you can think of, as well as contracts. So I have quite a bit of experience in this arena. I also understand how Ohio State works and what all the units are here. It's an enormous place, and it's a little hard to get oriented to it. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So the agenda that I want to put forward today, I don't want to bore you to tears. I know this is the last presentation before you guys can get out of here on a Friday. I want to keep it high level. I want at the end of this for you to understand soup to nuts, like what is the beginning of the grants process and what does it look like when you finally get down to the end? Because I know that if you're working on the proposals, it's a little hard to see beyond that stage because you're so concerned about actually getting the money in to get going on your work. So I want to provide an overview of the entire process and touch on the topics lightly so that you have something to kind of go back to and hang your hat on and know what kind of questions to ask as you work your way through the life cycle of a grant. We'll also talk about the different offices in the Office of Research so that you understand what they are and what their roles are and how they affect you. Okay? And throughout this entire process, if you have any questions, it's a small enough group, just raise your hand and I'll answer them as we go through. All right? So let's start with the different offices in the Office of Research. The Office of Research is the central unit that is in charge of the research mission at Ohio State University. The VP for Research is Carolyn Whitaker, if you've heard that name, and she's the president of the Office of Research. Within the Office of Research, there are a number of different units that you'll interact with for different aspects of your research. The first one is the Office of Sponsored Programs, which is the one that I used to work for. I was a sponsored program officer there. Those are the people who help you with your proposals and your awards. Proposals, the fancy term for that is pre-award, and awards, the fancy term is post-award, okay? So they do pre-award and post-award management, and these are also what's called the institutional signing officials. These are the business officials who are allowed by the university to sign proposals on your behalf and sign awards and negotiate the award documents. The Office of Research Compliance is another unit that all of you are going to have contact with. This is the unit that manages the conflict of interest disclosure process. So you will, at minimum, deal with this office once a year. They also deal with export control and with scientific misconduct, which hopefully none of you will ever have to deal with. The Office of Responsible Research Practices is the one that houses and supports the IRB, the IACUC, and the Institutional Biosafety Committee. So if you do anything that involves animals, human subjects, or anything biosafety, you'll be working with the good folks at ORP as well. Also in the Office of Research are two other units, ULAR, University Lab Animal Resources. These are the folks that take care of the animals in the vivarium, so the veterinarians are in there. Also, when you're putting together your proposals, and if you have animal subjects in the proposals, you need to know how much is going to get charged every day for caring for the animals. These are the people that handle that part of your information for your budget. They know what the per diem charges are for the cages. The Industry Liaison Office, that one is one that tries to foster connections between industry and the faculty here at Ohio State, the different experts here, try to get more contracts in, and to push our research out to the world. And then finally, another office, which isn't technically in the Office of Research, I think it's under business, is the Technology Commercialization Office. This office handles all the patenting. So if you have an invention, you report it to the TCO, okay? And then they're the ones who figure out with you if it's something that should be patented and licensed out to industry so that you get your inventions out to the world and do good. They're also the office that you'll work with if you need a material transfer agreement. So if you've got an antibody that you want to share with a colleague at another university, you need to have an agreement in place in order to do that, to be allowed to do that, and that's called an MTA, and TCO takes care of those. CDAs are confidentiality disclosure agreements, or also called non-disclosure agreements. This is when you want to share something proprietary, something that should be kept confidential with somebody outside the university. Say you want to talk to industry and you don't want them to run off with your awesome idea, okay? So you need a CDA in place to do that. And vice versa. If industry wants to come to talk to you and they want to share a protocol with you, they're going to want a CDA in place before they'll do that, okay? So that's the office that takes care of those. So I know that sometimes there's a question, just very basic, like what is OSU's role in my grant? So it's my research. I know what I'm doing. Lord knows that none of these administrators understand what I'm doing. What is it that OSU does? Well, most importantly, it stands between you and the sponsors, okay? It is the legal entity that accepts or applies for and accepts grants and contracts on your behalf. So even though you're doing the work of putting together the proposal and you're doing the work of figuring out the budget, figuring out the research plan, figuring out the milestones and deliverables, everything is on you and you're supposed to get that, you technically are not the one who is applying for it, okay? It is the university that is applying for it on your behalf. They stand between you and the sponsor so that the university is the one who will take care of any liability issues. So it's a protection for you. And at this point, I always want to say that if it looks like a contract, walks like a contract, smells like a contract, or quacks like a contract, you can't sign it, okay? Unless it's your terms of the contract that you signed to come to work at Ohio State, just assume that you're not allowed to sign it. So if it looks anything like a contract, if it binds you in any terms and conditions, if it's a letter that says, congratulations, we're giving you $5,000 to do your work, just sign on this line and return this to us and we'll send you a check, you can't sign it. You've got to talk with somebody to figure out who the appropriate person is. Somebody who should be able to help you with that very quickly is your sponsored program officer, because they see these kind of things all the time, okay? And that's the person in the Office of Sponsored Programs who will help you, okay? The kinds of places where this happens most often are your small foundations. They often don't understand as clearly as the federal government does or state governments that they're really working with the university on behalf of you all. So like a small foundation will often want to work directly with you and they're going to send you paperwork and they're going to send you a check, they'll send you an award, and you need to talk with somebody like me or your sponsored program officer to get it to the right place, okay? So keep your eye out for that. Also, the Ohio State University provides you with tools to help you manage your proposals and your grants. And the one-stop shop for all the Office of Research electronic tools is called Research Online. So this is a great link to bookmark, because it'll give you all of the electronic tools for responsible research practices, for sponsored programs, your conflict of interest disclosure, everything is there. It's a good place to visit if you're trying to find a particular tool. So with that, let's start talking about grants in particular. And I always like to show this particular life cycle picture, because it really is, and you guys understand this. When you put together a research proposal and you do the work, the next research proposal is probably building on the work you've already done. So it really is a cycle. We're going to talk about grants starting with the proposals and talk about how that works at Ohio State. We'll go through notice of award, what's going to happen when you're performing the work here at Ohio State, and then what happens at the closeout process. And of course, you start all over again with your proposals, okay? So let's start with proposals. And I know that this is actually very difficult because money's tight these days. So everybody's turning over every rock they can in order to find some sponsor who's interested in your research, because that's the key. If you're a microbiologist, American Heart Association probably isn't going to fund you. You got to find a sponsor that actually wants your proposal and is excited about what you're doing. So there's some advice that I have to find these sponsors. You might want to look at InfoEd Spin. This is a service that Ohio State subscribes to, and it's within the Office of Research. Sponsored websites, like for your professional organizations, may have some clues. Maybe they actually have grants that you can apply for. Your mentor, okay? More experienced researchers have probably seen just about every sponsor out there who's interested in your kind of research. Talk to them, find out Is there some $1,000 thing, $5,000 thing, $10,000 thing? If your mentor is applying for $5, $6, $7 million awards, they're not worrying about the $10,000 ones, but at the beginning of your career, maybe this is exactly what you need to get you started. So talk with your mentor, find out about the small stuff too. A lot of sponsors do have early career awards, and not just NIH. There are other private sponsors who are interested in helping people get started. So look for those awards in particular, because generally what has happened is that people will get fellowships. So you get a fellowship, you wind up getting a career development award, and then you can get a small research grant, and then you have enough data for getting the big ones, the big R01s. So it starts small, but it snowballs on up. So the last thing I want to say on this is when you find the notices of, or the funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs they call them nowadays, make sure you review them very, very carefully. Read the funding announcement, and then read it again, and read it again, and read it again, because the information you need to be successful is all within there. And a lot of them will even have the review criteria. So you've got to read those announcements and understand them front to back before you even get started with writing your proposal. So once you find something you're interested in, who needs to know about it? Okay? Essentially, you are not alone when you're applying for a grant. All right? When you're applying for a grant, you have an entire team, whether you know about it or not. Okay? Your team is your mentor, so you're the PI. You've got a mentor. You probably have a grants manager. How many people here in the College of Medicine? Number of you. There are a lot of grants managers in medicine, so find out who your grants manager is. That's the person in your department or in a college office who is going to help you with your proposal, getting the administrative stuff out of the way. You shouldn't have to worry about what the DUNS number is or what a DUNS number is for the Ohio State University. That's what your grants managers are for. And if you don't have a grants manager, your sponsored program officer at the Office of Sponsored Programs. If you don't know who your sponsored program officer is, go to their website, osp.osu.edu, and there is a constituency list on the website, okay? And it's just based on department, so just look for your department and you'll know who your SPO is. If you are somebody who's interested in doing clinical trials, you should know about your clinical trials office, because they're going to help you with budgeting. And your grants team, once they see what you're doing, they're going to review the funding opportunity announcement, and they're going to help you determine whether you should keep moving forward with this proposal. Maybe you found something that you think looks really awesome, but your mentor knows from experience, vast experience, that you just aren't going to go on this one. Maybe your mentor actually has reviewed these before and knows that you are not appropriate for the funding opportunity. So your team doesn't want you to waste time on things that there's no way you're going to get it, okay? So bring your team in on the loop, and they can help you whether to decide the funding opportunity you found is a go or not, okay? And then finally, a word about collaborators. A lot of times we need to find collaborators, especially these days in the sciences. It's not a solo operation anymore. If you need to find a collaborator and you're not sure who to talk to, one source for looking for such folks is OSU Peer Experts. If you just Google Pure Experts, OSU, it will come right up, okay? Other institutions have Pure Experts as well, so if you want to look at another institution, you could do that, but you could type in a keyword like diabetes, and it'll tell you everybody who's got diabetes expertise in the health sciences at Ohio State, okay? So it's a good way of finding some collaborators if you need some. Okay, so you found your funding opportunity announcement. Everybody says it's a go, it's exciting, we want you to do it. And I know from Stuart was kind enough to send me some of the questions that folks had about managing their grants. And a lot of the questions that he sent to me were about budgets. So I want to assure everybody in this room that you can do a budget, okay? Maybe nobody trained you how to do a budget, because that's the way of the world. Nobody tells you how to do these things. But this isn't rocket science. You will be able to do it, okay? I'm going to give you some high-level advice on how to do it. And if you can manage your budget at home, you can do this process. You totally could do it. You people are pretty smart. So the goal for the budget seem kind of obvious, is that you want to cover the cost of the research that you're going to be doing, that you're going to propose. And you need to gather some information before you can get started. So what is it that you are doing? So what is your scope of work? What are the experiments you're going to run? You can't really know what to budget for until you know what you are going to do. So let's think about this. This is like a stupid aim, I know that. Comparing gene X from several species of Drosophila to determine how they're related. Okay, yeah, it's totally fictional. But this isn't. You know within aim 1, you've got a series of experiments that you have to do, or a series of things that you need to do in order to answer the question, in order to get at the hypothesis, or whatever it is that you're doing. What do you need in order to run those experiments? Do you need DNA sequencing services? Do you need a PCR machine? Do you need reagents? What do you need? How much do you need of it? And how much do those individual items cost? Get out a spreadsheet to start adding things up, okay? Really importantly, who is going to do the work? If we're not talking about a fellowship, if you're talking about a research grant like an R21 or an R01, you're going to be doing some of the work as the principal investigator, obviously. Sit down and think about it. How much of your day, every day, are you going to spend working on this? And what proportion of the day is that? That's your answer. That's how much time that you need for you. Now think about the other people. Do you need a research associate? How much of that person's time? What are they going to be doing? How much of their day they're going to be spending working on this? Do you have any co-investigators? Same question. What are they going to be doing? About how much time are they going to be spending working on this? Okay? So you need to know what supplies and services you need to get the work done, who's actually going to do it, and how much of their time, right? How much of each of these people's time are you going to need? This, I think, is probably the trickiest part of budgeting, because it's a little hard to imagine sometimes how much of another person's time you're going to need in order to get a series of things done. This is a time where I think it's very helpful to talk to your mentor, talk to your co-investigators. How much time do you think is appropriate for this role that I'm going to put you in on this particular proposal? And if this person is at all experienced, they're going to be able to come back at you pretty quickly and say, oh, 5% is fine, or 10% sounds appropriate, or whatever the answer is, okay? More experienced people have a very good feel for this, so use that experience. And remember that budgeting, it's a financial expression of your research. So once you know what your research is, you can figure out what the budget is. It's a conversation. So I know that when you're building your proposal and you're working on your specific aims and you're writing all of that up and thinking about it and talking to people, things kind of evolve over time as you get toward the end of that process. That's fine. What that means is that you're probably going to have to come back and rethink what you need and how much of it you need, who you need, and how much of their time you're going to need. So you might start out with one iteration of the budget, and as your research plan develops, your budget gets finalized. Okay? It's going to change over time, and that's perfectly fine. Okay? It's a conversation. I like to think about budgets sort of like your kitchen. So doing experiments, in a microbiology lab is sort of like running recipes. So if you sit down at the beginning of the week and you figure out what all your meals are for the coming week, you know what you're going to need to build all those meals, right? You know kind of how much time you're going to need to make each of the recipes, and now you need to figure out what your grocery list is going to be like, and how much you're going to spend on those groceries. It's the same process. It's just with fancier and more expensive stuff. Okay, same thing. Some questions that come in about whether there are any workshops that people could take to learn how to budget, whether there are any software packages for doing this. I'm not aware of any, because once you do it a couple of times, it's not rocket science. There are spreadsheets out there for you that you can use. Just ask your sponsored program officer for a copy of their Excel template. That'll give you like your basic line items that you should be thinking about when you're putting together your proposal, and that's about as fancy as it gets. It's not much harder than that.
Carla?
Yeah.
If you've plugged in the 5% or 10% time for some of these people, how do you know what their salary is or the fringe rate is?
Yep, we're getting to that. So the kinds of items that you're going to see on a template that you get from your SPO or your grants manager are really common things like salary and benefits, supplies, equipment, animals, human subject stipends, F&A, we'll talk about what that is in a moment, subcontracts, that sort of thing. The biggest one by far on almost every single proposal is salary and benefits. This is probably 85% of costs is salary and benefits. It's huge. You have to use the salary that's in the HR system, and you all don't have access to the HR system. You've got to talk to your grants manager or your sponsored program officer because they have access, okay? So they'll get that information into the template for you, and all you need to do is provide your SPO or grants manager with the percent effort for that person, and they'll figure out the rest of it for you, okay? There is a special fringe benefit rate for the Office of Sponsored Programs project. So if you're on a sponsored programs project, you have a different fringe benefit rate than the university uses. Your SPO knows all about that. You have to figure out if you've got graduate students who's paying for the tuition and fees. Every college has a different policy. Generally, you're probably going to have to pay for it off of a sponsored project or a grant. That's another term for it. Think about the efforts. So I've seen proposals where people will say, I'm going to spend 85% of my time on this R01, this NIH grant. Wow, that's really, really, really high for a principal investigator. This is the time where I would suggest talking to your mentor to figure out if that's really reasonable for the grant, if it's something your grant's budget can bear, and if it makes sense, because if you get any other grants in, now you're going to have trouble because you can't be overcommitted. You've only got 100% time. And if you're spending 85% of it on one grant, that only leaves you 15% for everything else you've got to do, from teaching to administration to service and any other grants. So we have to think about what's reasonable, okay? And be very careful not to propose more effort, like put into your grant, that you're going to spend 50% of your time on this grant, but the grant's only going to pay for 25% of it. Because you just promised 50% of your time, which means 50% of your salary and fringe benefits is going to go toward that scope of work. And if you promise it in a proposal, you very well are going to have to deliver on that later on, whether or not you really meant it. So without cost is not really without cost. That 25% in my example is that cost to your department. Your department chair has to approve that, because that's something called cost share. That's a university donation of money toward your research project, okay? So anytime you're donating university resources, your chair has got to approve that. Does that make sense to everybody, how that works? Okay. Supplies, animals, human subject stipends, et cetera, all these are very common expenses. Here again, you look at your recipes, look at your research plan. What is it that you need to buy in order to get those aims done, and plan accordingly? Don't under budget. I know that it's very tempting to think that, well, I'm going to come in I'm going to put together something that's really awesome, and I'm going to do it on the cheap. Your reviewers know what stuff costs, so if you're promising the pyramids of Giza, but you're only paying for a Datsun, they're going to recognize it right away. That's not good for you. And also, even if they accept it, you still got to deliver on the scope of work you promised, okay? You're putting in that you're going to do these 3 aims, but you only have budget for 2 aims, you still have to deliver 3 aims. You just said that your department is going to pay for the rest of it, okay? So you can't under budget. Don't hope that your project goes better than expected. So be realistic and plan for the unexpected when you're putting your budgets together. Mm-hmm.
Is it reasonable to budget for a certain amount of overrun? Like, say I've got an inexperienced grad student who mixes up a reagent wrong.
Yeah.
X number of times. What percent, or is there a set percentage that's reasonable? Or?
No, there isn't. There isn't. And I think it's going to depend upon your lab. I mean, if you know that you've got somebody inexperienced at your training, maybe budget a little bit more. But if you've got some very experienced people, well, just plan for the odd thing that happens. So yeah, I mean, you have to plan for the unexpected, absolutely. So, any questions on that? Okay. All right, subcontracts and consultants. These are kind of like the same thing. It's just like who you're going to. What's the other party on this contract? A subcontract is with another entity, like a university or a company, okay? A consultant is a contract with an individual. You would do a subcontract when you've got a collaborator outside Ohio State who's doing the work in the context of their employment with that other university or company or what have you, okay? Because that contract, for them, there's a proposal, and then there's an agreement, a contract with that university, okay, for the services of that person who works there. On occasion, you'll run into situations where you've got an outside collaborator who's doing this work completely outside the scope of their employment. Maybe they're doing it out of their garage, okay? It happens, I've seen it. It's not infrequent, actually. Then you would be doing the contract with the individual, and that's a consulting agreement, okay? Your sponsor program officer will help you figure out which is which, okay? Because the budgeting on a subcontract is gonna look different than the budgeting on a consulting agreement. But your SPO will help you figure that out, okay? Subcontracts do take time to get going because you have to work with the other institution. Let's say it's another university. And when you want to work with another university and subcontract, to them, that's a proposal, okay? So they've got all the steps that you're going through to get your proposal in for just that one little piece of your big proposal. So start early. If you think you're going to need a subcontract, let your grants manager or SPO know as soon as possible, okay? So we can get all of that working for you. Equipment is also pretty common, but there are a lot of sponsors, especially the private ones, who just say flat out in the funding opportunity announcement that they won't allow it. You can't buy equipment using their grants. Our definition of equipment is something that costs $5,000, is standalone, and has a useful life of at least a year, okay? So a micropipetter is not going to be a piece of equipment for OSU. It might be for a particular sponsor. Some sponsors have different definitions. So check the funding opportunity announcement, talk to your SPO before you budget equipment. And then F&A, facilities and administration costs, also known as indirect costs, also known as overhead, also known as, why in the heck do I have to pay this? Everybody asks that question. This is a real cost. These are real costs that we negotiate with the federal government, Department of Health and Human Services actually, every couple of years. And they're the costs that are associated with research that are not easily allocable to a particular project. So this entire building is full of nothing but research, okay? But yet your research project is not getting charged part of the electrical bill, part of the gas bill, heating and cooling, all of that stuff, even though this entire building is research. The depreciation on the building is a research expense, but your projects are not getting charged for that directly. What happens is all of those research-related indirect kind of expenses are all lumped up into one big thing, and we negotiate with the federal government, tussle back and forth, yes, this is what it is, yes, this is what it is, finally come to an agreement, and it's a percentage. So at the current time, our rate is 54% of direct costs. So what that means is when you buy $1 of agarose, another 54 cents in indirect costs are charged to your grant to cover all of those indirect costs. Again, real costs, we're actually paying the electricity bill, we're actually paying the heating bill, okay? It's just that it's very indirectly related to your project, and that's why we have F&A or indirect costs. It's not optional. There are a lot of sponsors who limit it or who won't pay it, and they'll say that right up front in the funding opportunity announcement, but don't try to get out of it because it's what keeps the lights on literally in your lab, okay? It's real. We've got to have it in order to get things done at the university. If you have one of those sponsors who doesn't say anything about F&A, maybe it's $20,000, it's small, right? They don't say anything about F&A. You should be budgeting for 54%, but that's like a third of $20,000, okay? And you're thinking, I can't do anything on that. If you really want to get an exception to that, you'll need to work with your college and your department to see if they will let you use a lower rate than the 54%, okay? So it's not something that you can decide on your own. Administration has to do that for you. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, it's an ugly fact of life. And just so you know, 54%, very middle of the road. Universities on the coast have much higher, 60, 70%, much higher rates than we do. Ours is very middle of the road. This is not an onerous rate at all. So you've built your budget. Does anybody have any questions about budgets, managing budgets? Okay, so I've covered our bases there. Okay, so you've put together your budget. What are some other things you have to worry about? Well, think about your research plan, and maybe this is obvious to everybody, I don't know, but try to find somebody to have a look at it before you submit. Do an internal review and not just have the first person look at it be the actual peer reviewer at the sponsor. Before it goes in, you've got to have institutional approval. You remember I said earlier that OSU is actually submitting the proposal and signing off on it, sending it in on your behalf. Your sponsored program officer needs to know that you and all of the faculty who are working on the proposed work and your departments, so the department chairs, and all of the colleges involved are okay with the proposal going in before they can send it in. Okay, so there needs to be signatures. And that's done via something called the EPA 005. Again, see research online for that. Acronym City, OSU loves acronyms. I have no idea what PA 005 stands for. The E stands for electronic, because it didn't used to be there back in the day when it was paper. This form is just really basic stuff about your proposal. What's your title? Who's doing it? Who are the faculty? What are the departments, colleges? How much money are you asking for? It's simple stuff. What are compliance information? Are you using animal, human subjects, export control? Are you scuba diving? That is a question on the form. Sponsors may or may not require protocols to be approved at the time of your proposal. That kind of information is in there. Conflict of interest disclosures are in there. And all of this stuff gets signed off on, all the people, including you as the principal investigator. And once the form is all signed, it immediately routes to the sponsored program officer so they know they can submit the proposal. Once you have all the information, it takes just a couple of minutes to complete it. I've seen these forms route and be completely signed within 5 minutes. It can be really, really fast. So this is not an obstacle to getting your proposal out the door. The actual submission process. Office of Sponsored Programs does this on your behalf. Your sponsored program officer will actually sign the proposal, and out the door it goes. There are a lot of sponsors that have gone electronic, thank heavens. Back in the day when they were all paper, I can't tell you how many people would be breaking the speed limit, going to the airport at midnight, and sticking their foot in the door as it closes at FedEx to get it off to NIH. It happened all the time. So electronic is much nicer. So most of the federal ones are electronic at this point. A lot of private sponsors are too. There's a big tool called Proposal Central, which a lot of small private foundations use, and some have their own submission system, like the American Heart Association. Not a lot of them are paper anymore. Thank heavens for all of you guys and everybody's sanity. Peer review process. You guys understand this process. I don't need to go into this in too much detail, but I will say Ohio State is gigantic, and this is a real advantage in that all of our faculty are, a lot of them are involved in doing peer review. If you could figure out who is doing peer review, if they're doing it for the sponsor you're submitting to, you could talk to them and find out, what looks good in your eyes. So find out who those people are. Every once in a while they'll have a peer review mock panel kind of session. Go to those things. Find out who does peer review for NIH. Talk to them. This could be the golden knowledge that you need in order to get your proposal funded to push it over the line. Okay? And also during this peer review process, this takes forever, right? It's a long process. If you've got protocols, maybe you didn't need to have them approved when you submitted the proposal. That's the norm. You want them approved by the time that award comes in, okay? OSP is not going to sign an award document. You will not get your money. Nothing's going to happen until your protocol is approved, okay? Sponsors don't want to see an assigned award document until you've got an approved protocol. And I know in the past year we've had a little bit of trouble with NSF. They have been doing crazy stuff. We've had quite a number of instances where they said, hey, we want to give you an award. We want to see your animal protocol approval within 3 days. 3 days to get it written and through the IACUC. 3 days. And I kid you not, with NSF saying, oh, we're not going to give it to you, we'll give it to somebody else. Be ready. Hopefully we could put a stop to that nonsense, but you don't want to get caught there. work on your protocol. Okay, so take a little break. Life cycle of a grant. We've got all different offices that work on the life cycle of grant at different stages. Who is involved at the proposal, notice of award, performance, end of the award segment. I know you guys can download the slide deck afterwards, and so you'll have this and can look through it then. Okay, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail right now because we need to get onto the award because your proposal was awesome and it got funded. They want to fund you. Wonderful. What happens now? Okay, what happens now is that your protocols better be approved, and we just talked about that. Conflict of interest disclosures. Everyone's COI disclosure has to be up to date, and you all have to be clear. Okay, everybody has to be clear. Did you get a budget cut? Because that's kind of the awful part of this, and NIH does this all the time. So let's say you applied for 5 years worth of funding in R01, okay? I can't tell you how many times I saw them cut a whole year off. Congratulations, we're gonna fund you. You asked for $250,000 a year. We're gonna give that to you. This is so great, 4 years. You do the math. What's the percentage cut if they cut an entire year off? Yeah. 20% cut, it's huge. So if they're cutting an entire year off, can you do all of the work that you said you were gonna do? Because they didn't cut your scope of work, you could be sure of that. Can you get all the work done with the budget that they say they're gonna give you? Because if you can't, you may need to work with sponsor programs to negotiate with the sponsor to cut an aim or cut some things so that you can actually afford to do the work you said you're gonna do. Don't be afraid to do this, okay? They're not afraid to cut you. Don't be afraid to go back and say, I can't do everything I promised on the budget you're giving me, okay? Almost certainly you're gonna have to send them other support. What other grants do you have? You know, what's pending, what's actually out there? They wanna make sure that you actually have enough time to get the work done, and they also wanna make sure that you're not already funded to do the same scope of work. Nobody wants to fund the same thing that's already been funded, okay? They all wanna be special. And then contract negotiation. This is the sponsor program officer's role. They're the ones who are going to negotiate the nitty-gritty terms that you guys probably don't want to even think about, like governing law and indemnification and warranty and all the things that bore everybody to death, except your SPOs because they live and breathe this stuff, okay? So that's what they're going to have to do. All that got done. Everything's happy. You've got your money. Let's say you didn't get a cut. You're thrilled, you had your celebration last night. Now you stumble into the lab, now what do you do? 2 things, okay? First one is, and here's the one that you guys have been preparing for your entire educational career. You gotta implement the research plan that you proposed. But you've been preparing to do that. You guys could know how to do this, that's not a problem. The thing that I think a lot of people forget about is that successfully managing the funding aspect of it is just as important, because you have to show that you can manage the resources you've been given in an efficient manner and properly. If you can manage the sponsor's resources properly and get the scope of work done that you said you were going to do, you're doing a good job. But you have to do both of those things. It's wise use of resources, not squandering what you've been given. So how do you do that? First step. First thing to do, when you know you've gotten an award, go talk to your grants manager. Your sponsor program officer probably already knows about it because the notice probably came to them, unless you're one of those little foundations that I was mentioning earlier that wants to communicate with you. Make sure everybody is in on the loop. You probably, this is the happy news. You know, Rocky Dance, I did it, wonderful, right? So make sure that your team knows about it. OSP is going to send you an email notice. Hey, we got your award set up. Here's your project number. This is the magic number you need to spend, okay? Make sure that gets to the right people. Your grants manager needs to have that. If you don't have a grants manager, make sure that HR knows about it. They need to know what your award number is too, because your HR manager needs to know who to appoint to the project. So they need to know who should be on the project, when they should start working on the project, and at how much effort they should be on the project. If you know how long, that's just like gilding the lily. But they need to know who, when, and how much at minimum in order to start getting appointments on the project, okay? Really, really, really critical. This piece right here, if this doesn't get done, it's all sorts of work for you. This is the first thing you need to do. But what if in your excitement and your celebration, it just all slips your mind and you forget about it, and 3 months later it's like, oh, I'm not getting paid off my project. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Well, it's okay. We can go back and fix it. You're just going to have to do some extra work. You talk to your HRP. What they're going to do is transfer the expense associated with the proportion of your effort that you were putting on the project for the last 3 months onto the project after the fact, okay? So it's an after the fact expense transfer. And the more work piece of it is that you are going to have to say as the principal investigator for every single one of those pay periods that has to be transferred that, yes, this is okay, yes, this is okay. You're going to have to sign documents electronically, but you will have to sign some documents. And it's a lot of extra work for your HR people, so it's not the cool way of doing it, but it can be fixed after the fact, okay? We just don't like to do it. Brings down audit scrutiny as well, so another reason not to. Any questions on getting it right the first time or fixing it afterwards? Your grants managers are your friends, okay? They'll keep you out of this mess. The more fun part, like buying your supplies and all that, how does this work? This is sort of a bit of an arcane process. Basically, there's a workflow that has to happen. If you want to order, I don't know, what do you want to order? Give me something we're going to order today. Red Cap Services, rats, okay. Not on the same request, but you're going to put in something called an e-request. It's a system, the Ohio State system. Ask your grants manager what the link is. And in that system, you are going to ask for Red Cap Services from the CCTS, rats from Jackson Labs, wherever it is you're buying them from. You're going to put that into e-request. You're going to use your project number so that the person who's processing it knows where the expense needs to go. That is going to flow on to the next person. The requisition is going to be created and approved. There's 2 levels of approval that it has to flow through. Somebody's going to check to see, hey, does this requisition all kind of make sense? Is there enough money available for the requisition? And then it flows on to a second level approver, somebody who's going to say, yeah, this makes sense for this research project. You are going to have to approve it as the principal investigator in all likelihood. And then finally, for buying something off of sponsored programs projects, it goes over to purchasing at sponsored programs, and they do all the reviews there again too to make sure there's enough money, to make sure it's allowable, make sure there's nothing unallowable that you're asking for, like alcohol. You're never going to buy alcohol off of sponsored project, okay? So OSP is going to review it. If there's any question whatsoever on whether it's an allowable expense or not, that purchaser is going to kick it down to your SPO, and your SPO is going to review it, and they might be able to say, yeah, it's totally fine, and be able to go forward. But if they can't, they may contact you to ask you for some justification for it. And then they'll help you through whether it's allowable or not. Okay? So you might ask, so why does OSP have to process this? Why can't just your regular OSU purchasing do it? It's because OSP funds are restricted. Okay? They're for a particular purpose. It's restricted funding. So OSP procurement people are trained to understand what the rules are around the funding, and that's why they have to do it. Okay? The key really is this: allowable, applicable, reasonable. Is the expense allowable on the project? Can you buy equipment on this project? Does the sponsor allow it or not? Okay? Allocable. Can you allocate it to the project? I need to buy paper. I need paper. Well, that's an office supply, which is kind of a weird thing. Generally, that is part of F&A, so we generally wouldn't allow that on the project. But if you are printing off 1,000 surveys to do your project, that's allowable because you can allocate it to the project. If it's just paper because you ran out of paper in your printer, you can't say that's for that project, so it's not allocable. Okay? Reasonable. Would you as a taxpayer look at this and say it's a reasonable expense or not? So there's some common sense involved here as well. Okay? Just because you put it in your budget doesn't mean that you could charge it to your project. Sometimes people slip in office supplies and they're just not allowable. It's the way it is. The SPO will help you determine that. And this direct charge, F&A charge, that's that paper example that I gave you. Paper for your printer, just to have paper in your printer, that's an indirect cost. University pays for that, okay? Paper to print surveys, definitely a direct charge. You're busy spending, but you got to keep track of how much money you're spending too. So, I mean, if you are buying your groceries for the week, you got to kind of keep track of how much you're spending so you don't run over your budget. It's the same thing here, exact same thing. You've got to look at the rate of spending, because sponsors care about this, because your rate of spending is their proxy for how much work you're getting done. So if at the end of a 2-year project, or first year of a 2-year project, you've only spent a quarter of the funds, that's a red flag for them, that your work isn't progressing very well. Because otherwise, why wouldn't you have half of it spent? There might be a very good reason for it, but it is kind of a red flag that you may need to explain. Know that at the end of the day, even if you have a grants manager, you as the PI are responsible for how the funding gets spent. Okay, so you're responsible for it. You're responsible for making sure that the expenses that are hitting the project are for your project and they're allowable there. So for instance, if your effort on the project is 10% in year 1 and drops down to 5% in year 2, you're responsible for making sure that that change to 5% in year 2 happens, okay? Nobody else can read your mind. You've got to make sure that the expenses are hitting the project the way they should, okay? How do you know any of this? There is a tool for that. The Office of Sponsored Programs tool is called the PI Portal. It is pretty easy to use, pretty intuitive, but if you don't understand what you're looking at, please be sure to talk to your grants manager and they'll help you through it. Again, access it at Research Online. This is what the tool looks like. Very simple. Just some basic information on the top about your project and your budget. This is how much you have to spend. Expended is how much you've already spent. Money is out the door. Committed is how much you've committed to spend, but we haven't actually paid the bills yet, okay? So the next month of work, let's say, for next month of salary, let's say. And then the balance is just the budget minus the expended minus the committed. And then there's lots of detail for each of the items. Like this is what the personnel page looks like. So you could see how much you spent for person A, person B, and person C by month, okay? We've got this also for non-personnel expenditures and for non-personnel commitments. A ton of information in here to help you manage your tool or manage your project so that you don't overspend or underspend, okay? But once you have a project, if you want training in this, the Office of Sponsored Programs does offer some training. Your grants manager can walk you through it. You could call me, I will walk you through it. It's a pretty nice tool. My recommendation is that at minimum, you check the PI portal once a month to check your financials to make sure that everything is running according to plan. Just do it about a week into the month and don't look at it at all the last week of the month. There are so many feeds happening in the last week that things go crazy. I never look at it in the last week. So not the last week of the month, but once a month. All right? And if you have any questions, contact your SPOA grants manager right away so we can get problems fixed quickly. There are other things to keep in mind other than the money. A lot of compliance requirements. Your protocols have to be reviewed annually for human subjects, animal subjects. Conflict of interest disclosures need to be completed annually and updated depending upon your circumstances more than that. If you're traveling, other than going to conferences, working with foreigners, here or abroad, you may have export control issues that you need to work through. Office of Research Compliance deals with that. Responsible conduct of research. Anybody here on a training grant or have a K award? A little bit of that. Everybody who's on NIH training grants, K awards, if you have an NSF grant at all, people need to be trained in how to do research responsibly, and that's written into the proposal. This is something you need to work with your mentor on to develop a plan. And you've got to keep track of the training that you've done. And just to put a bug in your ear, there's that new employee learning tool called Buckeye Learn. You guys heard of it yet? You can upload your training into that to kind of keep it in one place and keep track of it, okay? So your supervisor will just have to approve those additions. But that would be a great place to keep track of this kind of training that you're doing. Another thing you're going to have to do 3 times a year, effort reporting. It's everybody's favorite. If you are appointed to a project as a principal investigator, let's say, 3 times a year, you're going to have to say that, yeah, the efforts that was on my project for the previous quarter are accurate. Essentially, what you're saying is that the amount of money that was charged to the project is proportionate to the amount of time I spent on the project, okay? So that's something that's a federal requirement. We've got to do it. Personnel expense transfers, or PETs, also have to be approved. Those are those expense transfers after the fact that I was telling you about earlier. This is the signing of those things. I don't want to get too deeply into this, but when you get these reports, if you don't understand them, don't sign them. Talk to your grants manager, talk to your sponsor program officer, or I'm loath to admit it, but I'm kind of the queen of effort reports. So if you have any questions about your effort report and you can't find somebody else, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email and I'll help you with it, okay? They're important to do because of the federal requirement, but I know they're confusing for people. Publications. This is the fun part. You're getting your publications out there, your science is getting done. Remember to cite the funding sponsor, NIH, American Heart Association, the CTSA if that's appropriate. A lot of times these are allowable expenses to have your publication charges there. But remember, if you are charging your grant A for the publication, that make sure that the citation and the charging all kind of matches up, right? So if you cite grant A, this is the grant that supported this research, and then you charged grant B for the publication charge and didn't cite grant B, now somebody has reason to come back and say, you charged the wrong grant, didn't you? That's an unallowable charge. Your department's going to have to pay for that. So make sure that you're not losing track of what work is supporting what publications and where the charges are going, because this is a really easy way to get caught with unallowable costs. Okay. Also, make sure that you know how your college department want to be cited. Saying that the James Cancer Hospital, was where your address makes it impossible to find that paper again if you're searching for the College of Medicine, let's say. Okay, so make sure that you know how you should be citing. And also, if you've got NIH, and this is coming true for all the federal sponsors, there's public access policy. So NIH has the policy that's the most robust, and you've got to have everything in a public repository. But this is coming online for NSF starting in 2016 in January. And all the other federal sponsors are going to require the same thing. Everything's going public. So this is something that you're going to have to get used to doing when you're doing your publications as well. Finally, we're getting to the end of your project. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is there a length of time, do you know what the standard length of time is that you have to deposit your?
I think it's going to depend a lot on the sponsor. For NIH, it needs to be available to the public within 12 months. Okay, so there's up to 12-month embargo period, but you've got to have the deposit done and have the identifier that goes with the deposit within, let's say, 3 months, I think. So it's pretty fast. You've got to get that number pretty quickly. And they'll know when you're out of compliance, because if you try to cite that paper in your progress report to NIH, you have to do it using My Bibliography, and My Bibliography is hooked up to PubMed Central, and it knows whether you've actually deposited it or not, and if you haven't, your progress report can't include that publication. So they got you coming and going on that one. Okay. Let's see, where are we? When you get to the end of your grant, if the work isn't done yet, and this is really super fly common, that the work isn't done and you need some more time to complete it, you can often ask for a no-cost extension. But you don't want to ask for a no-cost extension if you don't have any money, okay? You have to be sure that you have some funds left over at the end of the grant period so that you can have money to pay for things in that no-cost extension period. But if you need to have an extension, make sure you talk to your sponsored program officer, because they're the ones, again, institutional official, who's going to contact the sponsor and ask for it, okay? So they just need you to ask for it, and then they'll go ahead and ask for it on your behalf, okay? You also may have a type of a grant that doesn't allow you to carry forward from year to year, and that's kind of a, think of it this way. If you have a 2-year grant and you get $40,000 in year 1 and $40,000 in year 2, if at the end of year 1 you've only spent $39,000, what do you do with the $1,000? Okay? A lot of sponsors, they just consider it 2 years long and it doesn't matter. But there are other sponsors who really care about that $1,000 you've got left over, and you need to ask permission from them to carry that $1,000 from year 1 into year 2, so that in year 2 you've got $41,000 to spend. Your sponsor program officer is going to help you with this, and if you need to request carry forward, you're going to have to provide a justification and a reason for it, a reason why it wasn't spent and why you're going to spend it in year 2 and how you're going to do that. But your SPO will help you with that process. Finally, close out. Most sponsors require final reports. So NIH went electronic on this, thank heavens, because I can't tell you how many times they come back and say, where's your final report? And we'll say, we've already sent it to you 4 times. So they've lost things in the past. So electronic is much nicer. You're responsible for getting that in. Sponsor programs almost never sees these, but if you send it to them, they could put it in the file. So if the sponsor loses it, the SPO could just pull it out and say, we got it right here, and not even bother you with it. Okay? Easy breezy stuff. There's often a final fiscal report. OSP is responsible for doing that, not you. In rare cases, you'll have to sign it, but that's really rare. And final invention statements are also very common. You're reporting your inventions that you're making as you're doing your research. So OSP is going to coordinate with the TCO to figure out what those are and report them to the sponsor. So you don't have to worry about this either. So, and then the next step, of course, is to turn what you were doing into your next proposal to get funded again. So one final word. As you're thinking about your first research award, think about the timing of your aims and your experiments and when you think you're going to start getting publications out of it. Because by the time you get to the end of your grant and you need money to keep your lab going, to keep your research assistant hired, let's say, you need the money now. You can't wait for a round of funding to go through with having no money to pay your RA. The funding has to come right on the heels of the first grant. So really, when you're writing that first grant proposal, you need to be thinking about getting enough publications out there and enough work done so that you can write that second proposal before your first award is finished, so that that funding can follow straight on. So think strategically about that. Make sure you can get your publications done in the first couple of years, or some of them out there, so you've got a track record to run on when you submit that next proposal. Okay? So that's just something that I've noticed over the years that people sometimes forget to do. All right? So that's managing your grants. High level. There's a lot more in it. If you have any questions after this, if you don't understand something I said, want me to repeat it, want more details, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or give me a call. I'm happy to help you no matter which college you're in, okay? I'm happy to help. So thanks very much. Hope you all have a really nice weekend, and I hope you learned a lot today.
Thank you, Carla.